Hey, what's going on YouTube? This is Nick Villalon, National Brand Ambassador for the Macallan.
And I'm Sniff from ScotchNSniff, and today we're here to ask you just a couple of questions. So this is going to be the first in a series of interviews that we do with brand ambassadors. I think going to Scotland and sitting down at the Craigellachie Bridge and sitting down with a bunch of ambassadors and just talking to you guys about your life, it was interesting to hear just the perspective from the other side, because I think a lot of times you guys get beat up by a lot of people who are like, I want free stuff, and that like is only part of who you guys are. Like, it's a small part. Like that, I get it that it's your job, but hearing things like the support systems that are in place for brand ambassadors and how you guys encourage each other and get together and hang out, and it just seemed like there was so much more to it. So I guess we'll start with the first question. I've got a whole list here on my phone. The first one we're going to start with is, how did you become a brand ambassador for Macallan?
You know, it's funny because I've been doing this for a number of years now, the brand ambassador gig, about 4.5 years at this point. And in terms of questions I get asked, that's number one. Forget about the whiskey. That's the number one question I get asked. How did you become a brand ambassador?
Get free whiskey?
And I think my answer is 3 words, and that's passion, love, and luck.
What's the difference between those first two?
So you have to be passionate about the category. You have to be passionate about the topic that you represent. So for me, it's single malt Scotch whiskey. Then you have to love your brand. A lot of people just want to get into the ambassador gig to say that they are, but then they don't have a real love for the brand, and you see a quick turnover of the ambassadors for that specific brand when that happens. And then luck, you have to be in the right place in the right time. So for me, it was really just coming into the corporate side of the alcohol business, the beverage business, and being surrounded by an incredible team that recognized that I had somewhat of a talent and wanted me to grow that talent and put me in positions where I got the chance to become brand ambassador.
It's not luck, that's people supporting you, and that's always a good thing. Yeah. Those are called friends.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I consider myself lucky to have such good friends.
Yeah, for sure. That's always awesome. It's funny you say that with a little bit of luck, though. I remember I was talking to, I think David Laird was the first brand ambassador I ever talked to from Balvenie, and hearing his story of how he was just in a bar and just, someone from Balvenie overheard him say, like, no, guys, we can't just order this, I think it was maybe like 15 single cask or something like that. We can't just order this for now. Like, this is for a special occasion. And it was just weird to hear him talk about it like that. But that's, a little bit of luck doesn't hurt.
Absolutely.
But second question we're going to ask is, were you always a whiskey enthusiast? I already know the answer to this.
Yeah, I absolutely, I've been a whiskey enthusiast for now 13 years. Don't try to do the math. I'm from Canada. Legal drinking age is 18 years old. And obviously my knowledge and my enthusiasm wasn't the same back then, but it only grew from there. And I can pinpoint the specific time when I fell in love with whiskey, and it was at the turn of my legal drinking age, birthday, essentially.
Why whiskey? Why not, like most 18-year-olds in Canada or Mexico or 21-year-olds in America are like, yeah, let's get wasted. Like, they're not thinking, oh, I'm going to go drink some whiskey.
Yeah, so when I turned 18, I was actually lucky enough to work right away in the whiskey, well, not in the whiskey industry, but in the alcohol industry. I was a bartender, and I worked for a liquor retailer. And so one thing that always made me very curious about it is trying to understand why one bottle was more expensive than another. It's, at first you don't know all the technicalities behind it. And so I noticed that happened even more for fancy wines and whiskeys. Those were really the 2 categories where that was the most obvious. So I started reading on the subject, and I leaned a little bit too far in the rabbit hole, and I've been falling since.
Oh man, that's how, I think it's how a lot of us get here. We have a couple of questions. We're like, hey, we should start a blog helping people to like drink whiskey and appreciate it, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I'm also falling down some kind of rabbit hole.
Yeah, every answer comes with more questions afterwards.
Yeah, and then I guess, why did you choose Macallan then? If you were working in the alcohol industry, I'm sure you could have pursued any brand. Why Macallan?
For me, it's the one brand that really turned me over to Scotch whiskey. It's when I had my first Macallan 18, is that I tasted the liquid, and I couldn't believe that was the same, that had the same name as other whiskeys I had before. Like, this was called whiskey, just like other ones. It was kind of that perfect storm of flavor, texture, long finish, easy to drink.
Chocolate.
And yeah, I think a lot of people that listen to this probably have a very similar experience. It's actually one of the things that I always hear in whiskey festivals and the likes. People say, oh, Macallan's the one brand that really brought me into the single malt world. It has kind of that easy drinking, yet complex and interesting flavor profile to it that attracts a lot of people to the brand. And for me, it's a love that was so deep in a very instantaneous fashion that it's something that always stayed with me.
So having had it for like 13 years now, have you noticed a change in the general overall flavor profile of Macallan? Because it's something people talk about quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, the whiskey has changed as we perfected the whiskey over the years. And I'm a very lucky person who I got the chance to experience the Macallan side by side from yesteryears with recent expressions quite a few times. And today I can say without any worries that the whiskey that we make today is
getting better.
Is better than it ever was before. I think a big part of the conversation there falls back onto nostalgia. Sorry, I cannot pronounce nostalgia. Exactly. It's people having that memory of the whiskey, but sometimes the flaws in the whiskeys is what makes that memory of it so interesting. You know, for me, I've had a chance to try a lot of the 1980s Macallan because 1986 Macallan, 18 years old, was one of the first Macallans I ever got to experience, as it's my date of birth, and I was treated to that whiskey, and that was my first love of it. And so when I get to try that whiskey again next to the more recent Macallan, I can see that today they're a bit more complete, they're a bit more complex, they have a bit of a longer finish. Back then they were much fruitier, but a bit more one-dimensional. But it made a whiskey that was super fun to drink, but it wasn't as complete of a whiskey as it is today.
So all the people that complain that the Macallan's flavor profile is changing so much, it's because it's becoming actually more complex.
To my personal taste, but as we said in our other interview, it's always subjective. If someone thinks that the previous Macallan that they had that dates back to the 1980s or 1990s was better, who am I to tell them that they're wrong? It's their palate, and they're just as right as anybody saying the opposite.
I just wonder how much of that is true, though, what you're saying about it being tied to memories, because I think most of us who are buying nice bottles and enjoying them tend to do that around special events and occasions. So it's very, like, our perspective and our memories of it will be colored either way. So, all right, moving on to another question. If you could change one thing about Macallan or the whiskey industry in general, what would you change?
I would wish there would be more whiskey. That's the first thing I would change.
There's never
we're seeing that big enthusiasm for the whole whiskey industry right now, meaning that there's a lot of people that commit into the whiskey industry, and I think that's a fantastic thing. And I think it's not something that I would change about it. It's something I don't want to change about the whiskey industry, is that we keep it inclusive, that we keep it welcoming for people who don't know about single malt Scotch whiskey that are coming in, and that we make it something that's easy enough to understand, that they find that passion and that interest for them before we start, piling all that information on
science.
Like, to avoid what basically happened to some of the very high-end French wine in the late 1990s, where it became so complicated to buy a bottle of Bordeaux that people said, you know what, I'm actually going to buy this bottle from Argentina instead, because it was becoming so geeky and so nerdy. I think it's important to recognize the right moment to go that nerdy. And I like to go very, very nerdy about my whiskey, but I think it's important to not be tone deaf with the person you interact with.
It's funny because a couple of whiskey websites, like, that was their number one. I remember reading an article earlier this week about their number one most read article of the year was one about how there's a female who had written an article about how she went to this very exclusive tasting, and it was, very posh, and these people were very, very snobbish, essentially, about, she used much harsher words, but they were very snobbish about how the whiskey industry is and how they perceived it. And so she's like, this is exactly what whiskey isn't anymore. Yep. And maybe it used to be at one point, but today, it's become so diverse, and it's become so, like, accessible to everyone, thanks to, like, the internet, thanks to YouTube, thanks to things like this, that, like, anybody and everyone can get into this and enjoy it at different price points,
Yeah, it might be the Canadian to me, but I want whiskey to stay kind of that brotherly love and sisterly love kind of element.
That's why it's so nice.
For me, the whiskey community is one of the things that makes me wake up every morning and be excited about what I'm going to read and what I'm going to learn about this thing that I share a passion about with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people, just by looking through my phone.
Yeah, that's always the best. That's always fun to get excited about. The last question I have about whiskey specifically is, what are your thoughts on transparency?
I'm a big fan of transparency, but I'm going to circle back to what I just said. I think it's important. It has its time and place. But for me, I'm a big fan of transparency because I think that it now shifts the conversation about single malt to what really matters. After years of, us, the whiskey industry itself, the distilleries, marketing it like the older the better. That was the only messaging that went out in the 1970s and the 1980s. And now with that demand for transparency, we shift back to what really matters. What's the cask makeup? was it first fill cask, second fill cask, which type of oak, which type of sherry seasoned it, or was it another type of finish? That to me is very, very interesting, and it shows that the whiskey industry is moving forward. And so I'm a big fan of transparency as a whole.
That's good stuff. That's exciting. Let's move on to the questions that are a little less about whiskey. No, maybe this first one's about whiskey. So what's your favorite Macallan?
My favorite Macallan is sitting right there, Macallan number 6. Outstanding whiskey. To me, it kind of sends me back to that first sip of Macallan I've ever had, using a lot of that first fill European oak sherry cask coming from our typical cooperage's Tevasa. And it is, to me, the quintessential Macallan. I would agree with our master whiskey maker in that fashion. Not that I want to tell him how to do his job.
But you're doing a good job, Bob. Keep it up.
Thank you, Bob, for Macallan number 6.
And then your favorite, I know this might be blasphemous on a video about Macallan, but you're interviewing you. So what's your favorite non-Macallan?
Well, that's easy. It's our sister distillery, Highland Park, 18 years old.
What? Really?
Absolutely.
Oh, it's a solid bottle.
To me, Highland Park 18 years old is also a fantastic whiskey. It's one of the scotch that I like to enjoy. And, having had the chance to visit that distillery a couple of times, I find that Distram always sends me back. And to me, when I drink whiskeys that are not Macallan, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a whiskey that makes me travel, that brings me back to some of my memories, and none other whiskey than a Highland Park 18 years old.
I feel like there's a giant nerdy transition we could make about Macallan travel series, but I'm not going to do it. You said the word travel, and that was enough to get me to think about it, but certainly I have 2 more questions. The first question is, what's your favorite non-whiskey alcohol to drink?
That's a good question. I would have to admit that Scotch whiskey is almost all I drink on a regular basis. I would say that wine is that other alcoholic beverage that I really like. Actually, wine was a big part of my upbringing as a bartender and as an alcohol retailer when I was working in that facet of the industry. And I have a big interest for wine, as it has a lot of similarities with Scotch whiskey in terms of how it evolves and how it uses casks in the making. So I would say wine would be that answer.
It's interesting. And the last question is just one simple word, and you can just answer yes or no. But haggis.
No.
What? Really?
No.
Have you tried it? There's so many good ways. There's fried haggis.
I've had haggis. I've had fantastic haggis. I've had haggis reinvented, but none of those ever made me feel like I would order a haggis if I had to. Unless I had to.
It's a rookie mistake.
You know what? I'll take it.
All right, and that's the end of our interview. I'm sure this will get more interesting as we go with them. But
absolutely.
If you guys have any other questions, comments that you have for Nick or for myself about Macallan or whatever it may be, just go ahead and leave some comments and some likes in the area down below there.
Absolutely. Or you can reach me on Instagram. I'm at Macallan Nicholas. That's Macallan with N. Then my name's gonna pop out. No H to Nicholas.
There's no other Macallan brand ambassador with an N in the beginning of the name?
If there is,
what if you get
I'm
Nicola?
The first to pop.
Nicola. See? What about her?
Yeah, I think my name still comes first.
What can you do? Can't win them all.
She's a great follow. If ever she pops up first and you follow her, she's fantastic.
She is hilarious and very nerdy and runs too much.
And is also Canadian.
Is she really?
Yeah.
It's weird. All these nice people.
Taking over.
Nice people, nice whiskey. I see what's happening here.